Hi, it's Sally-Shakti, Star Priestess and Visionary Writing Guide, and welcome to Writing and Thriving for Visionary Writers. And today I am really happy to be joined by Scott Thurston, who is a great and long-term friend of mine and somebody I'm very keen to welcome into our space to talk to us today about writing. We're going to specifically speak about poetry, dance, movement, and writing for well-being and creativity. Scott's got loads to talk to us about. Scott is a professor at the University of Salford, I think. Yeah, no, still correct.
Yes.
And so I'll let Scott introduce himself now and tell us a little bit about your practice as a writer and a dancer.
Thank you, Sally-Shakti, and thank you for inviting me to talk about my work. And yeah, it's lovely actually to have those themes kind of recognized and sort of valued in a way, because they're so entangled for me in the work that I'm currently doing. Yeah, so to try and give a bit of an overview, I guess my background's in poetry. I began writing poetry when I was a teenager, and I still do write every day, almost every day. But 20 years ago, I fell in love with a movement practice called the Five Rhythms. And that kind of radically altered my sense of my embodied self, and influenced my writing almost from the get-go in a very profound way, which has led to me now developing a practice I call Poetics, which is a kind of integration of poetry and movement in performance, which I've done in collaboration with professional dancers, but also I have a solo practice that I take out to poetry readings and show on a regular basis. And another thing which overlaps, a kind of third phase of activity, which I guess has been really active over the last decade, has been collaborating with therapists and exploring ways of developing creative arts therapy in a way that can potentially address mainstream approaches to mental health treatment in the UK. So a research project's emerged called Arts for the Blues, which is a creative arts therapy model for group work. And I've been involved in that, yeah, for nearly 10 years now. I mean, it's really, that includes all of the initial kind of exploration, but now it's a kind of entity that's delivering work in a pilot form for the NHS. So we are kind of arriving at quite an interesting moment with that work. I'll say more about that, I'm sure, but the final piece of the puzzle is that a couple of years ago, I also started training as a counsellor and psychotherapist myself. And so I'm currently on the edge of qualifying and preparing myself for a dissertation at the same university where I'm also working in the English department, which has, yeah, been a very interesting experience. So yeah, three strong overlapping threads which are increasingly more closely tied together in all sorts of ways. I hope we'll be able to unfold today. So.
Wow, absolutely. It just seems you are extremely creative and prolific with your research and your practices. I'm sure not many professors of English would consider taking on a qualification to become a psychotherapist at the same time.
It is a bit bonkers, but it's one of the best things I've ever done, actually. So.
Amazing. So let's go back to the beginning, Scott. I'm curious. You were writing before you were dancing and moving, and you said that discovering finding your relationship with the Five Rhythms dance movement impacted your writing quite early on. So how does that fit together for you, and what kind of effect did it have on your writing?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about that chronology, actually, it's made me think it's not entirely true that I wasn't dancing before writing. I did go to nightclubs in my teens, and I was already a writer at that point. I think what was different about Five Rhythms is that it was the conscious attention to movement that emerged in that space, without all of the kind of club culture that you get if you're involved in that sort of scene. So it was a real revelation to me, and the way I always come back to kind of describing it, although I don't know how long it took me to kind of phrase this at the time to myself, but that conscious attention to movement felt like the kinds of experiences I would have reading and writing poetry. That's kind of always been the best way I can describe it, so that making it a phrase of movement kind of had all the dynamic and meaningful properties that I would get out of a line of poetry. So that was the kind of starting point, and in fact that I spent 10 years thinking about that question until I actually found somebody who had an answer to it in a really fascinating way. But I can park that and come back to it. But I guess the way it influenced my writing was in many different ways, and that's everything from actually just simply writing about the experiences I was having in the dance, because that was so full of richness and complexity. I'm kind of, I've been briefed by you that your audience will be familiar with Five Rhythms practice, but if anybody isn't, it's a movement meditation practice which follows a structure of energy, a wave of energy which moves through flowing. I can illustrate these as I talk about them: staccato, chaos, which is a kind of letting go rhythm; lyrical, which kind of combines elements of the previous three; and then stillness, which is very much kind of breath focused. And can right. I often feel quite connected to Tai Chi and Qigong practices when I'm in the stillness phase. So it's typically experience it with a group, with a teacher, playing recorded music. It can be done beautifully with live music, and it's an improvisational practice. So aside from that map of the way that energy can move in those five ways, you're not kind of learning or choreographing or showing the work. You're just doing it for the exploration, really. And so that can kind of be encountered in relation to oneself, in relationship to, well, you may work in pairs, you may work in, well, any configuration, small groups of 3, 4, 5, right up to working with an awareness of the whole group. So it's such a fascinating space for kind of encountering all kinds of stuff, really. And it feels therapeutic to me. And in fact, dance movement psychotherapy as a profession, which kind of emerged historically around the same time as Five Rhythms, does recognize it as a sort of allied profession, although it doesn't declare itself as therapeutic. So I was writing about that. I was also trying to use the formal structure of the Five Rhythms to write poetry. So I wrote a long poem simply called A Dance, where I tried to do the Five Rhythms in language. So there's a flowing section. There's even a warm-up section as well. It cycles through, and I tried to use, what I know of the techniques of language and poetry to try and create an equivalent form of it. And then just as I've gotten deeper into all kinds of other embodied movement practices, those in turn have all kind of layered in and become, I guess, a whole smorgasbord of research questions, really, about the relationship between movement and the self, embodiment, identity. I mean, a whole mixture of things, which I guess, again, I bring back to the poetry, and I use the poetry as a way of thinking and feeling and exploring all of those kinds of themes, really. So it's it's given me endless inspiration, and I'll be dancing it this evening, as I do every week as well. So that might be enough to get us moving to the next stage, whatever that is.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So I'm curious, you know, my own kind of thinking, my own academic brain is curious to know where you went once you started to get this sense that, you know, I recognize that sensation that you described, that what you were experiencing in dance was what you were also feeling through poetry. Now, I had that very similar when I read Dictate by Teresa Hakyung Cha. The first time, literally the first 5 times I read it, I didn't know what the book was about. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't have a clue. But what was happening for me was, it was a form of meditation that was so similar to what I was experiencing on the page, and what was happening in me when I read the book was so similar to what I had experienced in meditation and what I was experiencing in my yoga practice. I had this sense of recognition. This is what I want to do. I want to write in a way that helps other people have this experience too. And so I went towards looking at the formal properties of language, like form, structure, rhythm, to create that sense of, I think, connection with the breath, connection with the other through the text. Where did you go? How did you start to embody dance through your writing?
Yeah, no, that's such a interesting question. It's very kind of useful to hear you talk, because I know about your relationship with that work, but I don't think I've ever heard you quite express it in that way. And I recognize that very much. And I suppose for me, I mean, although I will jump to this theoretical reference point in a way, because it was quite illuminating on this point about what is it actually that makes it feel in this other medium that you're kind of experiencing something that you know from somewhere else. And the answer for me came from the writing of an American psychologist called Daniel Stern, who throughout his life, I mean, his background was in psychiatry, but also psychoanalysis. But he's most known for his work on studying the relationship between children and their caregivers, and specifically their patterns of communication. And there's all kinds of fascinating stuff in there. But his very last book is called Forms of Vitality. And some of the work that he was doing in these communication patterns led him to think in a more fundamental way about really big questions about how do we experience being alive. And he came up with a notion that we could think about this in, and it's a nice analogy or a kind of rhyme with 5 rhythms, that there would be 5 elements that constitute our vitality, and they are time, space, movement, force, and then always the one that puzzles me slightly is direction / intentionality. But you can't really separate these out. You can only separate them out conceptually. I mean, he applies this in the clinical context, but he was also absolutely fascinated by art, and particularly interdisciplinary art, work that would go across, say, dance and poetry, or music and theatre. And the theatre director, Bob Wilson, got very interested in, I'm calling him Bob because Stern always calls him Bob, but Robert Wilson, very famous American theatre director, got very interested in Stern's ideas. They did some collaborative research together. And also I found out more recently, the dancers Steve Paxton, who, and Arvon, who are both really, well, still are, I mean, some major figures in post-war American dance. Paxton was involved in the creation of contact improvisation, which is another movement practice that I've studied and enjoyed. They were looking at Stern's work in the form of he was using very slowed down video of these interactions between children and parents to try and understand, not just parents and other caregivers, trying to understand what was actually happening. And this was of great interest, it turns out, to people who were engaged in performing, because it was making things visible that hadn't been visible before, and yet were understood and felt and known in the body. And it was his view that these vitality dynamics in interdisciplinary art would sort of show up or be translated, so that something being articulated in a poem could be interpreted and articulated in dance. And that was the moment where I thought, yes, that's it. That's this thing that I've been obsessed with for the last 10 years. And he's found a way of actually framing it and conceptualizing it. And then I really understood why theatre directors and dancers were interested in what he was doing, because he was looking at a whole, not just the verbal aspects of communication, but the whole embodied aspects of communication. And really, really looking, I mean, he's dealing with films that are slowed down to 1/24th of a second. So that's the level of detail he's looking at how a communicative interaction unfolds. So if you look at dance, or if you look at theatre through that, you're suddenly opening up a whole world that, I mean, it's a bit like when computers arrive in choreography and the sort of ways in which that changes the way people can make art. At that point, it was video. It seems incredibly simple, but it was very powerful methodology. So that's, I mean, I wanted to get into that because I think it's sort of relevant, but I think your question was a bit more intimate about how it actually lands in the word. Yes, and I suppose that there's sort of many different incarnations of that now. But I think where it's gotten most interesting is where I've been working with a dancer, and professional dancer, often somebody who's as interested in writing as I'm in movement. And I've been very fortunate to have worked with 3 collaborators, and most recently Gemma Collard-Stokes, who's a wonderful dancer who works and teaches at the University of Derby. And we've been collaborating together now for about 5 years. And I think of all my collaborators, she was the one who came with almost the same amount of time that she'd been getting into writing and seeing how it could relate to her movement practice, in the same way that I've been coming from the opposite direction. And I think where it gets very interesting is where you've got movement and language in play at the same time. And it's not about the movement somehow illustrating or creating a visual metaphor for the writing, although sometimes that does happen, and that can be very interesting. And it's not also, I guess, the writing taking on the burden of sort of trying to describe what's happening in the movement. It's almost like there's a kind of an equal partnership. The vitality dynamics of each discipline are sort of standing in their own right, but they're in dialogue and they're moving together in a way that I find absolutely beguiling. And this, again, is something Stern labels this magic of putting these things together, which are similar, but they're not the same. And then it opens up something really, really unique and interesting. So, yeah, it's probably a bit general, but I hope that's useful.
Well, it takes us to the next place, which is that you mentioned that five rhythms is a practice of meditative movement, and it has a structure, the 5-part structure, but within that structure, it's improvisational. And so I also know of your poetry and poetry within the kind of context that we both participate in. It is that has a tendency towards experimentation, and to not be constrained by a preconceived concept or direction necessarily. It will usually have a constraint or a conceit that it's working with, but then we'll move into exploration, experimentation, improvisation. So how do you how do you translate that aspect of five rhythms, that kind of improvisatory experimentation, into poetry and then back out into performance?
Yeah, that's a really juicy question. I mean, I think what I realized actually, well, it's probably taken a while, but is that I've always been an improviser as a writer. That I've tended to write quite spontaneously in the moment, in the way, you know, a line or phrase would occur to me, and then just go with that phrase, and see what emerges. At least I think that's the default, and that's kind of goes back a long way. It's not the only way I write, of course, and there are ways in which it's much more a kind of constructivism of gathering materials and putting them together. And sometimes, although probably the rarest method is actually I have an intention that's quite specific, and I will structure and build a poem around that. But I think, you know, in a way, that the term improvisation, I think, has sort of been frowned upon somewhat in the movement community, at least, because I think it carries, at least in some part, a connotation that you're making something out of nothing. And in fact, that's seldom, if ever, the case. You're always working with something, and improvisation, I think, is just a different way of forming that relationship to your material. So there's often terms I've come across, like live editing or live composition or instant composition, which I really like, because it sort of suggests that even though, you know, the composition is emerging in real time, it's just as crafted and kind of technical as something that might be made off stage and then brought on and presented. And of course, even if you do that, particularly in dance, I think it's even, well, it's true of any kind of performance, there's always an element which is unfolding in that moment, which will, in terms of its vitality dynamics, be uniquely different. So there's all of those sorts of subtleties in that kind of range between improvisation and structure that kind of, I think, they're very, very different invitations. And I mean, I love form. I always kind of, I tend to write in sequences, and long sequences, where there's a kind of a rough sense of, like, the poem's going to be about this long, it's going to be in this shape, and then I just get interested in that. Eventually, I kind of feel like I've done enough and move on to something else. So there's always a need for a structure, but the thing that fascinates me is not quite knowing what's going to happen when you step into that. It's like creating the space of the studio or the dance floor or the room you're going to do a performance in. I mean, that's so much is about what the space is going to afford you or enable you to do. And the more you can be aware of those possibilities, the more you can do with the performance, I think. But it's creating the space in which something can happen that isn't entirely predetermined. So,
yeah, and I think there's a greater dynamic at play, or a different dynamic at play, when you are in collaboration as well with another person, of course, because there's a dynamic there that, you know, as you said, the performance is always going to be a different performance. It's going to be iterative on any occasion because of the different dynamics at play. So I remember watching your performance with your live performance with Sarah Mayer-Slee, the Vital Signs collaboration that you did. And from what I remember, there was movement, there was live writing, where you had some large like roll paper material that you were writing onto with marker pen. There were words being said in the moment. Can you talk us a little bit about through a collaboration like that and how it works, how you put it together?
Yeah, I mean, when I think of that performance, which I think of very fondly, and I mean, Sari kind of, her career unfolded in quite a different way from dance subsequently, and so she's worked actually in a very interesting role for the Salford Culture and Place Partnership, helping artists to make work and doing really interesting stuff. And that performance was really the culmination of 5 years of working together and exploring in every possible way that we could, really, these different permutations. And in a way, it's a very kind of full performance, I think, or possibly too full, with perspective, in terms of, like, we literally got everything that we'd investigated kind of represented in there. But there was a kind of a bigger underlying inquiry, I think, that was sort of about how we kind of relate to ourselves and to others, and to try and overcome differences in a way that is kind of non-violent, I suppose. I mean, the final scene of it was actually us utilizing some basic wrestling moves that we'd been taught by the poet and kind of quite competent wrestler stroke cage fighter Stephen Fowler, who came to Salford and for a fantastic day kind of gave us an introduction to basic wrestling holds and techniques. And we put them straight into the show, because they had a huge resonance for us, in terms of, because I think the important thing about wrestling historically as a movement form is that it's non-lethal. It's not about destroying your opponent. It's using the techniques and the physics of movement to sort of overcome them. But it's non-lethal combat. So it was a figure for us in some ways. It was also linked up with the biblical story of Jacob wrestling with the angel. That was one of the images that we were conjuring with. But we were right in the white heat of the Trump administration at that point, which, is kind of not far from our minds at the moment too. And thinking about, how do we overcome this desperate polarization that's going on at all levels of cultural, political, and social life. And so this wrestling was kind of a central image for that. But yeah, it's full of writing, it's full of uttered voice as well. Sometimes that was more like a poem, sometimes I think it was more like a character, or we were articulating kind of persona, a version of ourselves. So there were lots of different things, but it was very much the process of many encounters in the studio, exploring ideas, trying things out, and I think we tried to put those together in a way that we could show the range of what's possible, but also try and make it meaningful for that audience in that moment, to sort of communicate something about how we were in the world as artists and as people. So, that sort of answers that.
Yeah, fantastic, Scott. So what would you say about the relationship between your poetry on the page and your craft as a performer? Where's the relationship there, and where does the vitality animate that relationship?
Let me think very carefully about that, because that's a very interesting question. I mean, the challenge for me has been to build my skills as a mover, because I've been writing poetry for well over 30 years. I can't even put a figure on it, since I was a teenager, as I said, I think. So and I've been moving I've been doing 5 rhythms for 20 years, so I have a lot of movement experience, but I've never had a formal dance training. So that's kind of been an interesting problem to work with when I work with professional dancers. But I've recognized, and they've, part of the feedback I've had is that the 5 rhythms have given me a really good facility with improvisation, which is not necessarily always something you get with professional dance training. So that's shaped in a way how some of the work I've done collaboratively has been conceived of, although some of it has involved choreography, and I can learn choreography, I can make choreography, but it's not where I think I'm doing my best work. So I suppose, I mean, the pandemic was crucial in terms of actually obliging me to work more on my solo practice, because I couldn't go to the studio and I couldn't work with other dancers. All of that stopped. So I'm lucky enough to have a small space in the house where I can move, and so I just really started to dig back into what I could ask of my body and what my body knew and what my body wanted to say, and how it could do that in a much more intimate relationship with my own writing. And I think that's emerged in well, there's a score which I will typically take out at the moment for performance, which is a 3-phase score. And the first phase will be improvised movement or live composed movement. It'll be as much, I think, about getting me into the space and getting me settled and just sort of present. Although ideally I would try and do that before I start, but the trouble with taking dance to poetry venues is that it's not usually very accommodating of needing to stretch and warm up for half an hour by yourself. It's just impossible usually. So you know, I'd make do with what I can. But the next phase, I will dance with a poem that I've memorized, and that is a changing cast of characters, but they'll be fairly, you know, short prose poems, like a sequence I'm working on at the moment, which is in 3 parts. The first part came out as Terraces, and I made a film actually based on some of that material with a wonderful dancer and filmmaker called Maria Andrews. Second part is called Fail Safe, which is coming out with Broken Sleep actually later this year. So really short prose poems, and I'm just writing loads of there's over, you know, there's going to be a couple of hundred, I think, by the time I'm done. So I memorize one and work with it in movement. The third phase is allowing the poem to come in the moment. So it will be a live composed poem with movement at the same time, which is the hardest thing I've ever done. And it's taken, I think, a couple of years to just begin to get to the level of composition that I'm kind of content with, that if that, you know, that it's sort of like the thing that I would, how to say it, I don't know, it's a sort of standard I'd like to hold myself to as a writer, even though I'm dancing at the same time. So,
wow. I mean that but it's obviously it's a different practice, it's a different process. When we know that when we speak, the words come out differently than when we write. It's a very different form of communication, even though, I mean, ostensibly we're using the same language, but actually we're still using completely different codes, right? Those written words are not what's coming out of my mouth. We believe they are.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
So
And
I
in fact,
guess it's practice, and you're working at that edge of translation between the body, the voice. Where do we go with language? What does language mean for us? How does it move through us in different forms? Because, you know, those, like I said, those written symbols are not the same as the vocal symbols. We just have assigned the same meaning to them.
Yeah, but there's sort of, I mean, this, it feels to me actually, and I think translation is a useful term to think about this, and I have been using it actually to talk a little bit about these interdisciplinary practices. But I think that there's something here about the analogy between the sort of impossibility of something ever completely improvised and the impossibility of something ever completely composed. But we're kind of always in between, and I think language is like that as well. I mean, it's making me think of Derrida talking about writing and actually reversing the logic and saying that writing is actually the condition of speech. And I think that was a point that perhaps needed to be made at that moment. But what I think we have got is always almost like, to think in another Derridean way, a kind of haunting of one and the other. So, you know, speech, of course, it is a different kind of behavior, but it is it was still in relationship to writing, and as writing is always in relationship to speech. And I think the more conscious we can be of that delicious kind of tension and otherness, that's where the real juice comes for me, in terms of those edges. Can you kind of be really present with that tension as a performer? Can you kind of hold those possibilities at once? And it's like, that's what fascinates me about just bringing the movement and the poetry together, because it's something more than the sum of its parts endlessly. So
Yeah,
it's very suggestive.
and absolutely. And so when you're talking about working with perhaps like a memorized, so we'll park the improvisation aspect, and we'll go back to working with a memorized short prose poem, which I commend you. I've got a mental block about memorizing my own poetry. So how do you then bring that alive through movement without necessarily making it a kind of narrative translation where you want to kind of act out the poem, for example? How do you bring that into embodiment?
It's been such an interesting journey with memorizing text, because curiously, again, it's another one of those counterintuitive things. I feel freer with the memorized version than if it were on the page, curiously. And this was very much thrown into relief. I mean, there was a phase where I was just experimenting with learning poems to deliver them without movement, and before I'd sort of built up enough confidence and skills in movement. But I was working with a wonderful improvising vocalist called Steve Boyland in Liverpool. We were having singing lessons. I was having singing lessons with him, actually. But it turned into a performance collaboration, because he was very interested in poetry and we were both very interested in movement. So we began a dialogue in cross vocalizing, moving, and poetry. But he was the one who encouraged me to explore being off book, as they say in the trade, with poems. And it so utterly changed my understanding and my understanding of performance and my relationship to my work. The first performance like that, I'd memorized an entire sequence of 12 sonnets, and it took me a really long time. I was at that time commuting by road between Manchester and Liverpool, and I would have the recordings in the car to get the basic learning, and then that would be my rehearsal spaces on the road. So there were images kind of tangled up with motorway bridges on the M62 in my mind as I'm kind of finding my way through these poems. But it was really thrown into relief when I did a recording for Reverb and the BBC Radio 3 program with Ian Macmillan, and I was in the studio and I'd brought along a copy of the poem with me. I was about to record it into the microphone, but I actually realized at that point I more trusted my embodied memory of it than reading it from the page. There would have been no consequence for reading it from the page for performance dynamics, because nobody was going to see it. But I realized it was so embodied that was the place where it now lived. I think there's a memorizing and then there's an embodying. The embodying is, that's what takes the longest. But once it's there, I think it's almost impossible to get rid of. It's like another level of it. I'm not sure if I'm still on track to answer your question, really, but it was something. There's something about the freedom once it is embodied, that then it's really responsive to where and who you are at the moment that you actually deliver it, because that is so different, and it's always different. But again, it's about being a bit more conscious of how it's different in that moment, and having it embodied, I think, just enabled a different level of freedom, and not having to sort of close down the neck and the shoulders with the physical act of holding the book. in front of oneself as well, just being able to lift up and out a little bit and sort of free this area, and suddenly you're relating to audience in a completely different way. And for me anyway, that my heart is actually open in a different orientation. And yeah, it's wonderful to work like that. I don't do it so much just straight readings off the page, because I'm almost always moving now and making stuff. But yeah, it's a very different quality of being with the words. Almost like I had to embody them so I could take them into me. Actually, I think that's part of what that journey was about.
Yeah, that is so rich, Scott. And you know what I'm thinking of is slightly tangential, but something I've been thinking around in terms of oral storytelling, and when language then transferred onto the page, there's a difference in the, like you said, the connection that we have with that story or with each other through the story. And when language is embodied in that way, or a story or a poem is embodied in that way, we carry it differently. I think that part of what writing has done for myself as well, like I said, I have a mental block, and I know it's a mental block. It's not like I can't memorize my poetry. It's like I tell myself I can't memorize my poetry. And I think it's because when it's on the page, it's over there. I don't need to memorize it. It's over there already. And so bringing it back into the body in that embodied way is something, there's a very, very rich seam, I think, of human connectivity there that's really
Yeah, and I suppose I would also say, to sort of complicate it in a way, is that I wouldn't do that with every poem that I've written. And I think perhaps there are poems that I still think of as primarily having their life on the page in that dimension. Again, it's about perhaps having that as full a range of consciously made choices in relation to the work as possible. And there are some poems which are just, well, I suppose I could, I would love to learn my 5 rhythms poem, but it's I don't know, it's probably 150 lines or something like that, and I probably do almost know it because I've taken it out enough times and I've performed it with a recording and moved. That's tended to be a way of working, and then I've also invited other voices to read the poem and I move to it. I'd love to be able to memorize it, but it is just. And in a way, it wasn't written for that purpose. It was about putting the rhythms on paper. So I think part of it resists, even though I've taken it as far as I can with that part of it resists me actually being in the moment, articulating it in movement. I think the density of the writing in the chaos section and the dynamics of the movement it would require of me it would make it very hard to articulate the language at that point. So I think there are interesting limits to it. And I love poetry for the page. I love relating to the page as a writer as much as I love just being able to make the poem up on the spot. And actually, some of those poems, just that's it. They don't get recorded. I mean, they might get recorded by accident on video, but I'm not in the business of them transcribing them, and maybe I should sometimes. But I like also the possibility that they are just there for that moment and then they're gone, and then they exist in whatever is remembered of them by me or the audience. So it's a different kind of a gift.
Scott, your practice is so prolific, and I'm not surprised that you started off having singing lessons, again, of all things, and then turned into a collaboration.
Yeah, I was very fortunate.
Moves through you in such an embodied way, your creative practice and your creative process. We're coming towards the end of our time together now, and there's so much that we haven't even touched on. I just really want to congratulate you. Well, on a personal level, I want to congratulate you on your professorship, which is still relatively new. And I want to congratulate you on the work that you're doing with the NHS, which we didn't get a time to cover today. Maybe we can come back to that another time, because there's so much in this relationship between writing and well-being, that we could have, another whole conversation around.
Absolutely. And I will just say, without opening it up too much, because I know we're sort of in a closing phase, but I think one of the things that's become really clear to me in my training as a counsellor is just how much I've used writing for my own well-being my whole life, really, since I started writing poetry. That's actually been very much what it's been about, as much as anything else. You know, what I've learned about literary history and the circles that I've moved in, the critical work I've done. Well-being has been a really important part of that, and I think that is what continues to inform the arts for the blues stuff. And if listeners are interested in finding out more about that, we've got a pretty comprehensive website where you can explore, which includes videos of showing what the practice looks like, but also people who've experienced it talking about how they've encountered it. So there are places to sort of keep exploring. But yeah, I'd love to talk more about that and the implication of that hypothesis.
Absolutely, Scott. Thanks. And I think just to kind of bring us into completion, we've talked a lot about the technical aspects of writing poetry, dance, movement, embodiment today. And there's obviously a lot of clinical practice that informs your writing for well-being process. But I'm also guessing that there's a different embodiment of writing. When we're writing for well-being, we are bringing perhaps emotion through the body to move it in a different way. Can you just say a little bit more about that, perhaps?
Well, this is what I'm hoping to spend some time thinking about as I enter the dissertation phase of my master's study. Because I think what I've read about poetry therapy, and I'm by no means an expert on it, but I've just been doing the kind of initial literature review, is that it's just practice is incredibly diverse. And at one end, you have a sort of sense of that it's important to write about experiences that have upset you and disturbed you in some way. This is kind of the James Pennebaker, who's a sort of key American exponent of therapeutic writing, suggests, to the sort of other extreme of arts practice, which kind of values creative modes of exploring psychological experience precisely because they don't articulate things in language. Things can be processed in a different way. For me, of course, poetry is actually somewhere in between those poems, if you like, in that it can allow articulation of something, but because of the resources of language, it doesn't necessarily have to name it in a direct way. So it can be very enabling. But I know that that's just one way of writing, and it's not necessarily something that's very clearly held, I think, in the literature that I've seen. So I want to try and use it to look back at what I've learned about teaching poetry after sort of 25 years or so of teaching it in a university context, and see what is kind of useful for a therapeutic practice, and where there might be interesting gaps to explore, both in what I know about teaching and writing poetry, but also what poetry therapy knows about poetry, because sometimes it's delivered by people who don't necessarily have a developed poetic practice themselves. They may have a very deep affinity for poetry and indeed write some of it, but they might be coming from a very different perspective than I would be. And so I'm really curious about what can be done to sort of open that up, and particularly in this area of embodiment, and to sort of enable that view of poetry, because it results in poetry which isn't necessarily straightforward to understand if you're trying to just analyze it from a more intellectual perspective. But actually, if you recognize it, and I'm thinking of Maggie O'Sullivan's poetry here for some reason, if you recognize it on that deeper, more embodied level, it just makes perfect sense in another way. So, you know, I'd like to try and bring those perspectives into that area if I can. So we'll see how that goes.
I love that you brought in Maggie O'Sullivan's poetry and you know, coming back again for me to that sense when I encounter poetry like Maggie O'Sullivan's is it's visceral. It's the same as what I was saying about when I read Dictate. You know, it's visceral. It affects me on a very embodied level, and that's something I think that you're right, you know, isn't necessarily explored when we're conventionally looking at writing as a form of therapeutic practice.
Yeah, I mean, she was the first poet I ever saw perform, and I still remember that feeling in the body. That was how I received it. I didn't understand it, but I also saw her read last summer, just 10 minutes walk from my house. After all this time, and I still feel the same way when I hear her work. It's just really, it's such an extraordinary experience to be in her presence, and yeah, it's definitely something I want to try and connect with. And I know that's how we connected around. Maggie was present when we met in the context where we were, so it's nice to come back to her.
Thank you so much for your diverse embodied experience, Scott. Thank you for really touching just touching on that with us today, and then diving deep into some parts of it as well. I really appreciate our conversation, and it's been great to connect with you again.
Likewise, and I love how you've been able to really frame and enable and to get into the really fascinating parts of this work, which I know is a space you like to be as well. So yeah, thank you for the connection.
Thank you.